So imagine this, a highly successful Swedish entrepreneur, a guy who built a massive, profitable business completely from the ground up. He walks into a meeting with a communication consultant, sits down, looks this consultant dead in the eye, and declares with zero irony that every single person he hires is an absolute idiot. And he doesn't mean a few underperformers, he means his entire staff. His whole worldview is built on this assumption that the way he thinks, the way he calculates risk, how he talks, that is the only correct way to function in reality. So by his logic, anyone who does things differently is just broken, which is a terrifying mindset for a boss to have. But for the consultant sitting across from him, it's a fascinating cognitive puzzle, because the consultant listens, asks some probing questions, and slowly realizes this CEO doesn't have an idiot problem. He has a catastrophic perception problem. He's completely blind to his own behavior, and worse, he has no idea how his intense personality is violently colliding with everyone around him. That consultant was Thomas Erikson, and he realized pretty quickly that telling a fiercely arrogant CEO that he was actually the problem, well, that was probably going to get him thrown out of the office. So he took a different route. He went home and wrote a whole book about this exact phenomenon, a book he called Surrounded by Idiots, and that brings us to today. Because this book is not a simple story. We have Erikson's mega bestseller translated into over 50 languages, sold tens of millions of copies worldwide. And sitting right next to it, some incredibly sharp, honestly scathing scientific critiques. Critics have literally labeled this book the biggest scientific bluff of the decade. The contrast is striking. On one side, you have legions of corporate managers and couples who swear this book saved their careers and their marriages. On the other side, the academic psychology community is treating it like a plague of corporate pseudoscience. So what we're doing today is navigating right through the eye of that storm, unpacking the four-color personality system Erikson popularized, exploring the explosive scientific controversy that threatens to tear it all down, and most importantly, extracting the real, usable insights about human communication that live inside all of this. Because there are things here that can genuinely help you, whether the underlying science holds up or not. Let's start with the system itself and how it conquered the globe. To understand the scale of this book's cultural footprint, you have to look at the deceptive simplicity of the framework. The human brain is constantly overwhelmed by the complexity of other people. It's exhausting trying to figure everyone out. So Erikson's system offers a neat cognitive shortcut. It categorizes you, your boss, your spouse, everyone you know, into 4 distinct color-coded boxes. But the way this system actually reached the masses is a story on its own. Surrounded by Idiots wasn't engineered in some corporate publishing house with a massive marketing budget. Erikson pitched his manuscript to major publishers in Stockholm, and they universally rejected him. The title was too aggressive, borderline insulting. They didn't believe there was a market for a psychology book built around color. Normally, that kind of rejection just kills a concept. But Erikson self-published. And he didn't just upload it to a digital store and wait. He loaded boxes of physical books into the trunk of his car and drove across Sweden, walking into independent bookstores, asking owners to give him a few inches of shelf space. The ultimate grassroots campaign, and those bookstores that took a chance watched something rare happen. The books vanished. They sold out immediately. Because people were reading it, recognizing their micromanaging bosses or their chaotic partners in the text, and physically handing the book to someone else. It really highlights this universal desperation we have. We are all starving for a vocabulary to explain why interacting with certain people feels like grinding gears. So let's establish that vocabulary. The foundation of Erikson's system maps human behavior onto a 2-dimensional grid, which creates 4 distinct quadrants. The top half is task-oriented behavior, a cognitive profile hyper-focused on tangible results, speed, crossing the finish line. The bottom half is relation-oriented behavior, where the primary focus is on group cohesion, people's feelings, keeping social harmony intact. Then we add the horizontal axis. This one measures your energy and pacing. The left side is introverted, reserved behavior. People here prefer a slower, more methodical pace. The right side is extroverted, active behavior, high speed, dynamic, outwardly expressive. Cross those two lines and you get 4 quadrants. Erikson assigns a specific color to each one, and reading through these descriptions, it's an uncanny experience. You instantly start putting faces onto these colors. Let's start in the top right quadrant. Task-oriented and extroverted, the red personality, the dominant type. Reds operate at maximum velocity. Aggressive, intensely ambitious, entirely goal-directed. For a red, idle time is basically physical agony. They don't care about the journey at all, only the destination. The book uses this brilliant detail. A red driving on the highway sees posted speed limits not as a legal boundary, but as a mere recommendation. Perfect. It perfectly encapsulates their whole relationship with authority. High tolerance for risk, zero aversion to conflict. If a meeting is dragging into its 3rd hour of theoretical debate, the red is the person who forcefully interrupts the room, says that 20 minutes of talking was already too much, and demands an immediate decision. Highly effective, but incredibly intimidating to work with. Now let's shift to the bottom right quadrant, still on the high-speed, extroverted side of the graph, but dropping down from task-oriented to relation-oriented, the yellow personality, the inspiring type. Yellows have that same blistering energetic tempo as the reds, but their target is completely different. They aren't hunting accomplishments, they are hunting connection and social stimulation, relentless optimists, natural entertainers, the charismatic centers of gravity in any room. Their worldview is a place where the sun is always shining. The behavioral quirks are what really nail it. If you walk into an office and see a desk that looks like an explosion at a stationery store, coffee cups everywhere, disorganized files, hundreds of neon post-it notes, you are looking at a yellow's desk. Total chaos, but happy chaos. Massive networks of acquaintances, talking constantly, dominating the airspace, and notoriously terrible listeners. Their conversational style isn't really an exchange, it's a series of interconnected monologues. You ask a yellow a specific question and they completely ignore the premise. They launch into a tangentially related, entertaining story because they just want to keep the energy up. Masters of persuasion, but that enthusiasm masks a total lack of structural discipline. Now let's cross over to the left side of the graph. The introverted, slower-paced side. Bottom left quadrant. Relation-oriented and introverted, the green personality, the stable type. Research shows this is statistically the most common behavioral profile. Greens are the relational glue of human society, the counterweight to all that exhausting intensity of the reds and yellows, inherently calm, leisurely, deeply accommodating. If a green works in your office, they're the one who quietly remembers everyone's dietary restrictions when ordering lunch, or silently refills the printer paper without making a big show of it. Social harmony is their ultimate objective, but the downside is they are profoundly conflict avoidant. The book describes a green preferring to literally sink through the floorboards rather than voice a dissenting opinion in a heated argument. They actively strive to blend into the background. Let someone else take the leadership role, which leaves our final quadrant. Top left. Task-oriented and introverted, the blue personality, the analytical type. If the red is a bulldozer, the blue is a micrometer. Slow to initiate action, but when they finally do, their meticulousness is unmatched. They filter the entire world through logic, empirical facts, rigid structure, and there's this brilliant, highly relatable metric for understanding all 4 colors, which is how each one handles assembling a piece of IKEA furniture. A red rips the box open, ignores the instructions, and aggressively starts screwing pieces of wood together, assuming they can brute force the logic. The yellow imagines how incredible the finished cabinet is going to look, connects 3 random pieces, gets distracted by a phone call, and wanders away. The green leans the unopened box against the wall and suggests everyone sit down for a cup of tea first, so no one gets stressed out. But the blue carefully opens the box, inventories every single wooden dowel, and sits down to read the entire instruction manual cover to cover before they even reach for a screwdriver. Because for a blue, cutting a corner or relying on intuition is physically distressing. They need a comprehensive analysis of all potential risks before they move. They have to verify the data points themselves. Their main objective is absolute, unassailable perfection. They are the ones who find the critical spreadsheet error that the yellow glossed over and the red was too impatient to review. Now, one of the research observations that stuck with me describes this framework as the Hogwarts sorting hat for the corporate world, and that is painfully accurate. Gryffindor is the bold, charging red. Hufflepuff is the loyal, hard-working, spotlight-avoiding green. Ravenclaw is the analytical, intellectual blue. And yellow is basically a highly chaotic Gryffindor. But it highlights something real about human cognition. We are desperate for sorting mechanisms. Putting people into neat boxes reduces the immense cognitive load of social interaction. It gives us the illusion of control. Like if my manager walks in and starts barking orders and ignoring my input, my natural response is to feel personally attacked. But if I have this framework, I can step back and say, oh, he's not attacking me. He's just a red. That's his quadrant. It completely neutralizes the emotional sting. And Erikson includes an important caveat here about the purity of these types. He's explicit that a pure single-color personality is a statistical anomaly. He estimates only about 5% of people operate exclusively within one quadrant, meaning 85% of the people we deal with are complex blends. He posits that 80% of individuals are dominated by a combination of two colors, usually colors that share an axis, like a red-yellow or a blue-green. The rest are a blend of three. A four-color profile, he says, is actually impossible in his model. But the core argument is, we can't understand the blends until we understand the extremes. He frames it like baking. The pure primary colors are your raw ingredients. You have to understand the specific properties of flour, sugar, and yeast in isolation before you can comprehend why the bread rises when you mix them all together. Now, just observing external behavior, the loud voice of a red, the quiet stare of a blue, that only takes us so far. External behavior is just the symptom. We have to diagnose the underlying condition. And when the research pivots from what these colors do to why they do it, something genuinely poignant emerges. Because when you peel back the layers, these distinct, frustrating personality types aren't biological traits. They are deeply ingrained, highly specialized coping mechanisms. The behaviors that aggravate us the most are almost entirely driven by profound internal vulnerabilities and fears. Let's play this out, starting with the reds. We see them as aggressive, speed-obsessed dominators. The immediate assumption is they just have a massive superiority complex. They bully people because they think they're better than everyone. But that completely misses the internal mechanism. Red behavior is actually a defense against powerlessness. At their core, Reds harbor a deep-seated terror of being dismissed, ignored, or stripped of control. They require tangible proof that their voice dictates reality. So when a Red pounds their fist on the conference table, it is rarely about ego in a vacuum. It's a frantic defense mechanism deployed against the vulnerability of becoming irrelevant to the outcome. They assert absolute control over their environment, so the environment can't victimize them. Now let's look at the yellows, relentless optimists, life of the party. On the surface, who wouldn't want to be in a state of perpetual joy? But the tragedy of the yellow profile is that the joy is often performative armor. The research points out that yellows project this relentless lightness because they fundamentally lack the internal architecture to tolerate heavy negative emotional states. Sitting in a space of conflict, sadness, or rigorous critique feels genuinely unsafe to a yellow mind. So they deploy humor, distraction, and manic energy to artificially manipulate the mood of the room. They are desperately trying to make sure the environment remains a safe, happy place for them to exist. That reframes the loud, joking coworker completely. Their constant humor isn't a lack of focus, it's an active shield against psychological discomfort. What about the blues, the meticulous, detail-obsessed perfectionists? Why do they need the IKEA manual so badly? Because for a blue, uncertainty equates to danger. Their perfectionism is not born from a desire to show off how smart they are. It's fundamentally about constructing safety, safety from blame. A blue scans the horizon and sees infinite vectors for failure and criticism. If their analysis is mathematically flawless, if they've cross-referenced every single data point, they insulate themselves from being blamed. Their rigid structure is a fortress they build to protect themselves from the chaos of human error. So the red attacks to prevent irrelevance, the yellow deflects to prevent sadness, the blue builds walls of data to prevent blame. That brings us to the greens, the accommodating, pleasant, silent greens. Most people characterize them as passive individuals who just want to go with the flow and keep everyone happy. And that characterization is where most people profoundly miscalculate the green profile, because they appear externally passive, but internally they are hypervigilant, constantly absorbing the emotional undercurrents of the room. And this is the most critical distinction in the entire framework. A green's silence does not equal agreement, which raises an uncomfortable question. If a green is silently absorbing things they don't agree with just to avoid conflict, aren't they basically a ticking time bomb of resentment? The research explicitly validates that concern. It describes this exact phenomenon as silent resistance. Because the green prioritizes the superficial harmony of the group over their own need for expression, they will nod, smile, and verbally agree with the red boss during the meeting. But the moment that meeting ends, they retreat to the break room and complain bitterly to their peers about the idiocy of the plan, because they never actually bought into the idea in the first place. They just couldn't tolerate the acute stress of saying no out loud in a public forum. They swallow the friction, and because they don't have the release valves of a red or a yellow who process their frustrations externally, the green turns that frustration inward. This makes greens highly susceptible to chronic internal stress, particularly when they're managed by aggressive reds who mistake their silence for enthusiastic compliance, or when they're subjected to rapid, unexplained changes in their routine. So we have 4 fundamentally different groups of people, all utilizing completely different coping mechanisms, all terrified of different things, trapped in an office together for 8 hours a day. It's honestly a miracle human beings have managed to build anything at all, which naturally leads us to the collisions. We understand their internal fears now. What happens when you force these divergent colors to collaborate on a high-stakes, highly stressful project? Certain color combinations align naturally, while others guarantee mutual destruction. Harmony is typically found when you pair individuals who share an axis on the behavioral graph. Pairing a blue and a green yields a highly stable working relationship. Both occupy the slower-paced side of the spectrum. They afford each other the psychological space to process information without demanding immediate reactions. Neither one is going to pressure the other into a reckless gamble. Incredibly methodical and peaceful, maybe not the fastest engine in the world. Conversely, pairing a red and a yellow harnesses immense kinetic energy. They share the extroverted, fast-paced axis. Both rely on gut instinct, rapid execution, keeping momentum moving forward. A team of reds and yellows will generate a staggering amount of output and enthusiasm. And yes, the yellow is talking endlessly about feelings, while the red only cares about the bottom line. That does cause friction, but they share the same energetic frequency. Their communication styles are equally forceful, which means they essentially tolerate each other's volume. A red doesn't mind interrupting a yellow, and a yellow isn't deeply offended by being interrupted. They just keep moving. But the research spends a lot of time on the genuinely disastrous combinations. And the ultimate nightmare scenario in Erikson's framework is forcing a yellow and a blue to collaborate on a complex task. They sit on the diagonal of the graph. They share neither pace nor orientation. Picture this. A company assigns a yellow and a blue to co-manage the launch of a new flagship product. The yellow dives into the kickoff meeting completely blind. They haven't opened the briefing documents. They are vibrating with energy, pacing the room, throwing out wild, unvetted marketing ideas, talking continuously about how incredibly fun and revolutionary this campaign is going to be. And sitting motionless across the table is the blue, utterly silent. They have highlighted the technical instructions, they're running a mental stress test on the budget constraints, and internally their core temperature is rising with pure unfiltered rage. Because the blue observes the yellow's behavior and diagnoses them as a frivolous, undisciplined windbag. They feel that the yellow's refusal to respect the data is an active threat to the structural integrity of the entire project. And the yellow looks at the silent, scowling blue and sees a miserable, uninspiring bore who is actively trying to assassinate the joy and creativity in the room. And here is the true tragedy of this interaction. When the yellow senses the blue pulling away, the yellow's natural defense mechanism is to talk more. They try to charm the blue, overwhelm them with positive energy, which is the exact stimulus that drives the blue further into a state of icy, resentful withdrawal. A devastating negative feedback loop built entirely on the misreading of social cues. This dynamic exposes something vital in the framework: the anatomy of stress triggers. Because to effectively manage or entirely destroy someone's productivity, you just have to apply pressure to their specific color's stress trigger. Let's lay out the blueprint. How do you break a red? You strip away their momentum. You introduce sluggishness, layer upon layer of bureaucratic hurdles, and a total lack of tangible progress. If a red perceives that their most valuable resource, their time, is being squandered on theoretical debates or emotional hand-wringing, their internal alarm sounds, and the stress response is total transformation into a bulldozer. They sever all relational ties with their colleagues, develop tunnel vision on the immediate task, and become excessively demanding, blunt, and aggressive. The research uses a brilliant analogy for a red's temper. It compares their anger to a shot glass. When the pressure hits, the shot glass empties incredibly fast. They explode, they yell, they purge the frustration from their system, but it fills back up just as quickly. The red moves on instantly, holding no grudges because the emotion was expelled. Meanwhile, the greens and blues around them are deeply traumatized and left dealing with the emotional whiplash for weeks. How do you break a yellow? You starve them of validation. You introduce heavy, unrelenting skepticism toward their ideas. You physically or socially isolate them from the group. And the nuclear option, you subject them to public humiliation. If you aggressively critique a yellow in front of an audience, you completely shatter their core defense mechanism. Without the anchor of social approval, they sulk. They become hypersensitive to any perceived slight and completely abandon whatever fragile structure they had. If a task ceases to be fun or validating, a stressed yellow will simply walk away from it. How do you break a green? You introduce chaos into their routine, you leave critical tasks unfinished, creating an environment of loose ends, and you subject them to sudden unannounced changes in direction. Like a department head walking in at 4:30 on a Friday and announcing, "Forget the protocol we've used for 3 years, we are pivoting the entire departmental strategy starting Monday." That scenario is a green's psychological nightmare. Their entire coping mechanism relies on predictability and stability. When those pillars are kicked out from under them, their stress response is total withdrawal. They just shut down. They become completely empathetic to everyone else's needs while completely abandoning their own. Or worse, they develop a severe martyr complex, apologizing profusely for things that aren't their fault while internalizing a massive amount of unexpressed anxiety. And finally, the blues. How do you stress out the people who literally have a contingency plan for everything? You demand spontaneity. You force them to make a definitive choice without allowing them to review the underlying data. You tell them the established process is being ignored. Or, as the book amusingly highlights, you subject them to an unannounced weekend visit from their in-laws. The terror isn't social. It's the sudden violent destruction of their carefully scheduled timeline, and a blue's reaction to extreme stress is cognitive paralysis. They freeze. They retreat into endless recursive analysis, splitting hairs so infinitesimally thin that action becomes impossible. They refuse to make a decision because the environment no longer allows them to guarantee a flawless outcome. So under acute stress, everyone retreats to their worst, most exaggerated traits. But the research points out a massive dangerous blind spot when people use this color system on themselves: the self-evaluation trap. When individuals read these behavioral profiles, their own inherent color acts as a distorting lens, warping how they perceive the feedback. Reds operate with robust egos and an outward focus, so they naturally inflate their positive traits. A red reads their profile and concludes, "Yes, I am a dynamic visionary leader who drives results." They conveniently ignore the section detailing their tendency to trample their subordinates. Yellows possess a selective memory for criticism. They only remember the compliments. Conversely, greens and blues, who are inherently more introverted, cautious, and risk-averse, fall into the exact opposite trap. They read their profiles and catastrophize their weaknesses. They gloss over their incredible positive attributes, the green's unwavering loyalty, the blue's brilliant analytical capacity, and fixate entirely on the notion that they are too slow, too boring, or painfully passive. It's the ultimate irony of the system. The aggressive people who desperately need to change their behavior think the book proves they are perfect, and the quiet people who are actually holding the infrastructure of the company together read the book and think they are failing, which perfectly illustrates why objective external feedback is nearly impossible to process without a shared neutral vocabulary, and that is the undeniable appeal of Erikson's work. It sounds incredibly intuitive. It maps perfectly onto our daily frustrations. It gives us a compass for navigating the maddening behavior of our coworkers. It completely explains why millions of people bought this book and brought it into their boardrooms. It just feels right. But hanging over everything we have just discussed is a massive, scandalous shadow, a reality that every single listener needs to understand before they start color-coding their HR departments and their spouses. In 2018, Thomas Erikson, the architect of this global phenomenon, was awarded a very specific, highly dubious honor in his home country of Sweden. He was officially named Fraudster of the Year, and this title wasn't bestowed by a jealous competitor or an angry internet forum. It was the official designation of the Swedish Skeptics Association, a highly reputable organization populated by academics, researchers, and scientists dedicated to promoting empirical science and aggressively exposing pseudoscience. They didn't just critique the book, they labeled Surrounded by Idiots the biggest scientific bluff of the decade. To understand how a framework that resonates so deeply with human experience gets systematically dismantled as a fraud, we have to trace the origins of the color system, because the history here is wild. Erikson's color system is basically a modernized skin stretched over the DISC model, which was originally conceptualized in 1928 by an American psychologist named Moulton Marston. And before we even get to the science, the research offers this incredible piece of trivia about Marston. He's also the man who created the polygraph systolic blood pressure test, the early lie detector, and more famously, the comic book icon Wonder Woman. A man of diverse and eccentric interests. But while his comic book legacy endured, his psychological theories were built on sand. Marston's 1928 book, Emotions of Normal People, proposed that human behavior was dictated by the flow of something he called psychonic energy. He hypothesized that this energy physically transferred through a literal web of nerve cell junctions that he termed psychons, psychonic energy flowing through psychons. That sounds like the premise of a 1950s sci-fi B-movie, not a foundational text for modern corporate HR. It was an early, totally flawed attempt to map consciousness and emotional stimuli to physical neurology. Marston argued that the 4 personality archetypes emerged based on variations in the structural integrity of this psychonic network. And here's the glaring issue. Modern neuroscience has completely and unequivocally debunked this. Psychonic energy does not exist. Psychons do not exist. It was a theoretical hypothesis with absolutely zero empirical evidence to support it, and it was entirely abandoned by the scientific community. So how on earth did a rejected, biologically impossible theory from 1928 mutate into a multi-million-dollar corporate training tool in the 21st century? In 1956, an industrial psychologist named Walter Clark dusted off Marston's 4-quadrant theory. He stripped away the psychonic energy jargon and repackaged the core behaviors into a personality assessment questionnaire. He aggressively marketed this tool to businesses as a way to evaluate and optimize their workforce. It was a commercial success, eventually evolving into the modern DISC profile. And the Swedish skeptics pointed a massive spotlight at this rotten foundation, but they didn't limit their attack to Marston's 1920s pseudo-neurology. They applied rigorous logical analysis to Erikson's specific modern application of it, and they found catastrophic contradictions within the author's own claims. In several interviews, Erikson proudly claimed that his own personal behavioral profile was a complex combination of red, blue, and yellow, Let's test the logic of that claim against the graph we built earlier. A red profile is fast-paced and task-oriented. A blue profile is slow-paced and task-oriented. A yellow profile is fast-paced and relation-oriented. When you apply basic mathematical logic to that claim, the entire system collapses. By claiming to be red, blue, and yellow simultaneously, Erikson is asserting that his baseline cognitive state is simultaneously extremely fast and extremely slow to react, that his primary orientation is simultaneously maximizing relationships and completely ignoring relationships in favor of tasks. It is the equivalent of claiming you are currently driving north, south, and east at the exact same time. It destroys the internal integrity of the model he is selling. But the skeptics weren't just playing academic gotcha. They highlighted the profound real-world damage this pseudoscience inflicts when unleashed in professional and personal environments. The danger arises when organizations treat a metaphor as a scientific diagnostic tool. The research documents deeply troubling instances of corporate HR departments using these color profiles to actively restructure teams, forcibly separating employees whose colors supposedly clashed on the diagonal axis, completely disregarding the employees' actual track records, technical skills, or proven collaborative success, managing people based on an illusion, and the damage bleeds out of the boardroom into the home. There is a deeply unsettling anecdote in the research about a teenage girl. She comes home from school, drops her backpack, looks at her mother with total depressive resignation, and says, "Mom, I'm a green." She said it as if she had just received a terminal medical diagnosis for a lack of ambition. Because a well-meaning school counselor had administered a color-based personality test, the complex developing psychology of a teenager was flattened into a single color, and she internalized the scientifically invalid conclusion that her neurological destiny was to be passive, invisible, and forever conflict avoidant. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And on the darker side of the spectrum, it provides aggressive individuals with a scientifically sounding alibi for workplace abuse. Toxic managers verbally berating their staff, creating a hostile environment, and then waving away the HR complaints by saying, "I can't help screaming at them. I'm a red. You can't punish me for my hardwired personality." It entirely removes personal accountability from the equation. It creates a closed ideological loop. You attach a label to someone. They eventually adapt their behavior to fit the expectations of the label, and you use that adapted behavior as absolute proof that the label was scientifically accurate all along. But the absolute climax of this entire scandal is how Thomas Erikson ultimately responded to this tidal wave of empirical criticism. When a scientist is challenged, they produce their data. When Erikson was cornered by the skeptics and asked to provide empirical data proving the validity of his 4 colors, he took to his personal blog, and he published a statement that essentially surrendered the entire war. He literally wrote, "There are no facts in my book." Let that sink in. There are no facts in my book. A book prominently displayed in the psychology section of every major bookstore. A book utilized by global HR departments to determine the trajectory of people's careers. The author publicly admits it contains 0 factual data. He essentially conceded that his work was not bound by the rules of scientific inquiry. So, where does that leave us? If the creator admits there are no facts and the entire academic community denounces it as dangerous pseudoscience, why are we still talking about it? Why did it resonate with tens of millions of people? And why do successful executives still swear by its efficacy? Because we have to learn to decouple scientific validity from practical everyday utility. Think about the difference between a high-resolution satellite image of a city and a stylized subway map. The subway map is geographically a total lie. The lines are drawn perfectly straight when the real tunnels curve. The distances between stations are wildly inaccurate. If you used it to measure physical geography, you would fail completely. But if your only goal is to figure out how to get from Central Park to Wall Street, the inaccurate subway map is infinitely more useful than the perfectly accurate satellite image. That is the precise mechanism of utility at play here. Surrounded by idiots is not a satellite image of human neurology. It is a subway map for interpersonal friction. It provided millions of overwhelmed people with a simple, accessible vocabulary to navigate the confusing behavior of their peers. It gave them a mechanism to discuss the difficult person across the desk without having to resort to calling them an idiot to their face. It serves as a de-escalation tool by depersonalizing the conflict. It removes the immediate emotional threat. When your coworker ignores your idea, your brain no longer screams, "They are doing this maliciously to undermine me." Instead, your brain says, "They are just processing the data like a blue." It forces a critical microsecond pause between the stimulus of their behavior and your emotional response. And buried beneath the debunked psychonic energy and the rigid color boxes, Erikson actually delivers a core, universally true insight, the golden rule of communication according to the text. Communication always happens on the listener's terms. That is the philosophical core of the book, and it is empirically sound. It fundamentally shifts the burden of communication. It asserts that it does not matter how eloquently, clearly, or logically you formulate a message in your own mind. The only thing that dictates the reality of the communication is the specific psychological filter the listener is using to decode it. Their current stress levels, their inherent biases, their behavioral pacing. All of those factors mutate your message upon arrival. Let's ground that in something practical. Think about your own inbox. You've probably spent 30 minutes crafting a highly detailed, nuanced email proposing a new strategy, sent it to your boss, and received a one-word reply. Okay, you probably felt insulted, but let's apply the framework. Let's say you have to pitch a new software platform to 4 different stakeholders, a red, a blue, a yellow, and a green. If you draft one universal email and blast it to all 4 individuals, you guarantee that at least 3 of them will misinterpret your intent, ignore the email, or feel alienated by your tone. You have to adapt the architecture of the message to the specific receiver. Let's run the simulation. You are drafting the email to the red executive. Brutal brevity is your only tool. You lead immediately with the bottom line outcome. What is the return on investment, and when does it happen? You eliminate all social preambles. Do not ask about their weekend. Do not provide a 3-paragraph backstory on why the old software failed. Use bullet points. State the required action and get out. Because the moment a red sees a wall of contextual text, their brain registers it as a waste of time and they close the tab. Now you are sending the exact same proposal to the blue data analyst. You deploy the exact opposite strategy. A blue's trust is built entirely on verification. You must show your mathematical work, attach the raw data spreadsheets, outline the testing methodology, provide a comprehensive risk analysis. If you only send a blue the bottom line summary, they will automatically reject the proposal because you have denied them the ability to verify the structural integrity of your logic. You have to prove the math before they even look at the answer. Next, you are emailing the yellow creative director. With a yellow, data is the enemy of enthusiasm. You absolutely do not attach the blue spreadsheet because a spreadsheet will instantly kill a yellow's momentum. You open the email with genuine social warmth. You reference a previous positive interaction. Then you frame the software proposal as a grand, exciting vision. Sell them on the emotional impact, the innovation, and how much fun the team will have using it. And finally, you are sending the proposal to the green project manager. The critical element with a green is pacing. You lay out the implementation steps with extreme clarity, but you actively avoid creating any false sense of urgency. You ask for their input. You emphasize how this will make the team's life easier. And you give them a generous, explicit time frame to process the information before demanding a response. And what I find so powerful about this approach is the distinction that needs to be made here. Altering your email structure is not about manipulating the listener. It is an act of deep empathy. It's about adapting yourself so that the core truth of your message actually survives the perilous journey into someone else's brain. It requires a significant amount of ego suppression. It forces you to abandon your own default communication style, which inherently feels correct and natural to you, and do the hard work of translating your thoughts into the native cognitive language of the person sitting across from you. You take the burden of translation upon yourself, rather than lazily forcing the listener to decode you. And that principle is a highly effective, empirically sound approach to interpersonal dynamics, regardless of whether you label the listener red, blue, or polka dot. Now, let's say a listener is totally bought into this concept. They recognize the profound value of understanding personality variations to lubricate communication. But they are a psychology student or they work in a modern HR department, and they want to utilize a diagnostic tool that won't get them laughed out of a room by data scientists. What are the validated alternatives to the four-color pseudoneurology? The research actually provides several excellent alternatives ranging from the absolute gold standard of empirical science to more nuanced frameworks designed for deep personal development. We have to start with the heavyweight champion of modern personality psychology, the Big Five, widely known by the acronym OCEAN. If you want empirical validity, the Big Five is where you go. It is backed by decades of rigorous, peer-reviewed, cross-cultural academic research. Unlike DISC, which attempts to shove you into one of four rigid boxes, the Big Five operates on the premise that human personality is a fluid combination of dials. Much like a sound engineer's mixing board, it measures where you fall on a continuous spectrum across five core traits. The O stands for openness to experience. This dial measures your baseline intellectual curiosity, your preference for novelty versus routine, and your comfort level with abstract, complex ideas. High openness correlates with creative, unorthodox thinking, while low openness indicates a preference for concrete facts and traditional methodologies. The C is conscientiousness, and this is a great place to contrast real science with the color wheel. A highly conscientious person might look like a blue because they are organized, disciplined, and goal-directed. But the Big Five recognizes that you can be highly conscientious without being a slow-paced introvert. You can be an aggressive, fast-paced person who is also deeply organized. The traits are uncoupled. The Big Five doesn't force false correlations. The E stands for extroversion, which measures how much you seek external stimulation and social engagement. The A is agreeableness. This measures your orientation toward others, your baseline levels of empathy, cooperation, and trust versus skepticism and competitiveness. And the final dial, the N, which is neuroticism, though many modern psychologists prefer to reframe that as emotional stability to avoid the negative stigma. It measures your reactivity to psychological stress. How easily do you experience negative emotions like anxiety, anger, or vulnerability? The beauty of the OCEAN model is that it provides a highly accurate, high-resolution portrait of a person's cognitive tendencies without reducing them to a single inescapable archetype. It's definitely less catchy than calling your boss a red, but it actually survives the scrutiny of a laboratory. Now, if someone is looking for a framework that is less about clinical data and more about deep introspective personal growth, the research points to a different model, the Enneagram. This system has seen a massive surge in popularity, particularly in executive coaching and team building. It maps out 9 distinct personality types, but it fundamentally differs from DISC in its target area. While the color system focuses almost entirely on observable external behavior, how fast you walk, how loud you talk, the Enneagram bypasses behavior entirely and focuses on internal core motivations. It asks the critical question, why are you doing this, rather than just, what are you doing? It identifies core fears and core desires. For example, it categorizes types with titles like the Reformer, whose core fear is being corrupt or defective, or the Peacemaker, whose core fear is loss and separation. It is a profoundly deep system for understanding the invisible engines that drive people, and critically, it maps out how those motivations dynamically shift when a person is under extreme stress or experiencing a period of psychological growth. It acknowledges that human beings change based on their environment, whereas the color system implies you are statically red forever. The third alternative in the research is the 16 personalities model, which is a modern iteration heavily based on the classic Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI. This is the one most people encounter in corporate orientations. The 4-letter codes like INFP or ESTJ, the MBTI evaluates individuals across 4 distinct cognitive dichotomies. Introversion versus extroversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and judging versus perceiving. It functions essentially as a framework for explaining the mechanical processes of how different brains prefer to intake information and subsequently make decisions based on that information. The MBTI has its own detractors within the hard sciences, largely because it still relies on binary categories rather than spectrums, but it offers a significantly more granular, nuanced, and mature vocabulary for workplace dynamics than a four-color wheel. The takeaway here is that if you want to dig deeper into the mechanics of human behavior, you are not trapped with Marston's 1920s psychonic energy. There are incredibly robust, highly developed tools available. The colors are just the training wheels to get you thinking about empathy. They are the gateway drug to psychological awareness. So what does all of this mean for you? We started by exploring a wildly popular, highly intuitive four-color system: the dominant red, the chaotic yellow, the accommodating green, the meticulous blue. We saw how brilliantly it can describe the maddening behavior of your most difficult coworker. But then we pulled back the curtain to discover that this multi-million-dollar corporate empire was built on the thoroughly debunked pseudoscience of a 1920s comic book writer leading the scientific establishment to literally crown the author Fraudster of the Year. But by sifting through the academic outrage, we managed to rescue the baby from the bathwater. We realized that even a scientifically invalid map can still help you navigate the subway. Despite the lack of empirical rigor, Erikson's book delivers a highly functional, immensely practical lesson in cognitive empathy. It forces us to confront the reality that our default method of communication is not universal, and that actively adapting our style to the listener's internal frequency is the only reliable key to actual human connection. It's a deeply flawed instrument that nonetheless plays a beautiful tune. But before we close out, I want to leave you with one final thought, something directly inspired by the origin story we discussed at the very beginning of this episode. Think back to that highly successful Swedish CEO sitting in the consultant's office. Thomas Erikson created this entire framework because a man at the height of his power looked around the room and genuinely believed that everyone else was the problem. He was entirely blind to his own rigidity. So here is the challenge. Stop using these four colors, or the big five dials, or the Enneagram types merely to diagnose the flaws in the people around you. Stop using them to label your overbearing boss, or to conveniently excuse your own worst habits. Turn the analytical lens inward. Ask yourself what kind of person you become when the pressure becomes unbearable. Because when your project is failing, when you are feeling ignored, when your carefully laid plans disintegrate, or when your authority is challenged, your higher reasoning shuts down and your default coping mechanisms take the wheel. And in those dark moments of acute stress, you might just become the exact frustrating, impossible, entirely unreasonable person that someone else feels the desperate need to write a survival guide about. The truest measure of emotional intelligence is not understanding the colors of the people around you. It is having the courage to recognize your own capacity to be the idiot in the room.